Okay, so what's all this about the future? And what's all this about, um, you know, uh, what's all this about it being somehow urgent or for some reason urgent to reconceptualize what we mean by writing? Like, what, why? For what purpose? Who cares about grammatology? Or that grammatology might be a problematic word or might be a kind of contradictory um, um, idea, right? Who cares? Well, Derrida will sort of does sort of sketch this out at the on page 3, and then on to page 4 a little bit at the beginning of his book with the exergue, right? So, what is an exergue, right? It's another one of those playful words. I'm not going to really explicate it for you. All I'm going to say is that it's a synonym for exergue is simply right epigraph. Okay, an epigraph is a quote that is placed at the beginning of something, right? There's a lot of television shows that begin with an epigraph at the beginning of them. I told you I was just starting to watch The Wire. The Wire is one of them, where there's sometimes a quote, or maybe all the time, a quote at the beginning of every episode. Um, and there's a lot of books that have an epigraph too. In fact, most of the chapters in Christy Mallory's own double entry, or at least each time there's a reckoning of his double entry, there's another epigraph there, or there is an epigraph there. And so we might ask ourselves first, what does an epigraph do, right? Um, why these 3 epigraphs at the beginning of his book? Okay. Well, an epigraph announces an intention. It can announce a topic. It can announce some sort of direction, or it can establish some sort of mood, or point us in the right direction, uh, or clear up some sort of focus, right? But it never does so explicitly. It never does so explicitly. Sorry, I'm pausing because I'm hearing some sort of like thing outside. I'm hoping, hoping I don't get arrested or something. Um, but it doesn't announce these things explicitly or directly. Rather, it intimates them, it suggests them, and more than this, it actually clears some space in which a writer can then do some work. Okay. So I'm not going to read the epigraphs to you. I'm simply going to ask, right? Because really, that's the only important thing right now. Um, what do they have in common? Right? What do they have in common? Okay. Well, straightforwardly, what they have in common is writing. They all say something about writing, and they all seem to say something positive about writing. Okay, they say something positive about writing, and yet what Derrida is going to say is, for all that positivity, positivity, they also announce 3 other things. Okay, 3 other things. The first thing they announce is is that an ethnocentrism has always controlled um, throughout the history of ideas and thought, has always controlled the concept of writing. Okay, this is most explicit in the second epigraph. Okay, what is ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism, simply put, is judging other peoples or other cultures based on let's say, the values of the norms of your own culture, right? So Rousseau in the second paragraph, right, is aligning, right, the civilizational development of a culture or a people according to how advanced their writing system is, right? Um, so whenever there's a sort of treatise of writing, Derrida is saying there's always this sort of ethnocentrism built in, particularly to Western scholarship that presumes that signs of alphabetical or evidence of alphabetical writing in any culture is actually also a sign of its enlightenment and civilization. Okay. The second thing that Derrida is going to say, though, is that for all that for all the positivity of these quotes, they also betray a sort of linking between this ethnocentrism and what he wants to call logocentrism. This is another one of the italicized words in this section. Okay. is that ethnocentrism is linked to a logocentrism, or that ethnocentrism is a logocentrism. Okay. Remember what I said about logos when I was talking about the title. Okay. So some of this might seem familiar, all right? I wrote some of this down, okay? That the history of philosophy and theology has always aligned truth, or the origin or the truth of truth, with the logos, a Greek word that refers to reason, but also to word, to spoken word. The Christian tradition picks up on this, okay? Although Scripture, or the Bible, is written materially, it appears to us as written words, material words, it is guaranteed theologically to be true because it is the word, the spoken word, in Greek, the logos of God, the word of God. Okay. While writing may be a sign of a culture's maturity, that's what's sort of ethnocentric about some of these epigraphs. While writing may be a sign of a culture's maturity, philosophy and theology tend to keep it distant or separate from logos, a debased, derivative, secondary representation of truth. Okay. So the third thing that Derrida is going to point out in this section, and I'm not going to read any of it, right, is that at least in the late 19th and the 20th century, what you see happening is that in the development of modern science, the development of modern science is somehow based upon a kind of siphoning away of logos from the domains of philosophy and theology. Okay, that in science you have the development of biology, psychology, sexology, anthropology, all these ologies, all these new logos, right, that begin to supplant as the domain of reason and truth. Philosophy and theology, right? They sort of make those domains less important to the pursuit of truth, okay, and the pursuit of information and understanding about the world and the cosmos, okay. So while it is tended to siphon the logos away from those things, to make them less significant in the pursuit of truth and understanding, that science has nevertheless retained the logocentristic suspicions of writing that you see throughout the history of philosophy and theology, right? That science develops for itself in the 19th and 20th centuries a way to fix a direct, straightforward language for itself, non-phonetic, non-alphabetic writing. We see this in chemistry, we see it in theoretical and quantum physics, genetics, etc. And this sort of writing, or this sort of inscribing in science, is a kind of mathematical writing, a precise writing, a pure writing, free of metaphor, of metaphysics, and of theology. Right? What is it? It's a way of trying to communicate directly, because written language, alphabetic language, is insufficient to communicating and establishing and grounding the origin of the truth claims of science. Okay, so these are the three steps Derrida has sort of establishes in this exergue. Okay, number one, that our concepts of writing in the West are always linked to a kind of ethnocentric way of looking at other cultures from within our own culture and judging them as either civilized or barbaric, depending on how developed their writing system is. Okay, that's on the one hand. That's number one. Number two, that this ethnocentrism, far from being a sort of lauding of writing or alphabetical writing, is actually a logocentrism. Right, it's tied up with a whole history of philosophy and theology that that establishes as the origin or the ground of truth logos, or reason, spoken word, as the ground of truth, as opposed to writing itself, which can only be a representation or a derivative form of logos. Okay, And then 3, science. Well, science has tended to sort of siphon away or steal away the idea of logic or reason or the logos from philosophy and theology in the 19th and 20th centuries, that even though it's taken that away from them, it's taken with it, right, these assumptions about writing, and so has developed for itself non-phonetic forms of writing that are much more precise, pristine, purified, non-alphabetic, right, that can capture and be the new ground or the new origin of the truth, of scientific truth. Okay, so in each case, whether we're talking about the history of philosophy, the history of theology, or the history of science, there has been a kind of suspicion about alphabetic writing, even though alphabetic writing is seen as a sign of a culture's civilization, right? A sign of its development. Okay, all right. I hope that's clear. I didn't read any of that out loud to you, but that's sort of what Derrida is getting at in the first page of that book, of his book. Okay, and then onto the second page too. Okay, so because of the assumptions about phonetic writing as derivative, secondary, non-originary, because these assumptions are persistent in science, that is, in the logocentrism it retains from philosophy and theology, this is why, still, there can be no proper grammatology, according to Derrida. For this would mean bringing the non-originary into alignment with that from which it has always been critically separated: the voice, the origin of truth, the ground and certainty of presence, rather than absence. Yet, and this brings us to the next chapter, the rather fashionable interest in language and the expansion of what our culture has always seemed to indicate as writing, suggests that something important about how we might rethink writing, rethink the sign, rethink meaning itself, might be making itself visible here and now. Okay, and so with that, then I want to turn to chapter 1. Okay. So I'm not going to walk us through all of chapter 1. It's incredibly dense, and I want to save some of it for class. But I do want to give you some sort of introduction, some way to begin the chapter, because the first 4 or 5 pages are sort of difficult to get through because it seems as if they're organized in a weird way. Okay, so if you turn to the very first page, that's page 6, I think, right? Chapter 1 is titled "The End of the Book and the Beginning of Writing." Right? What he means by book, he doesn't actually really get to until page 18 of the chapter, right? And then really throughout the chapter, he's trying to redevelop what sort of glimmers of a different way of thinking about writing we might find, right, throughout the history of philosophy. Okay. He begins, we'll skip the epigraph from Nietzsche. However the topic is considered, Derrida writes, the problem of language has never been simply one problem among others. But never as much as at present has it invaded, as such, the global horizon of the most diverse researches and the most heterogeneous, meaning the most, most distinct and different and various discourses, diverse and heterogeneous in their intention, method, and ideology. The devaluation of the word language itself, and how, in the very hold it has upon us, it betrays a loose vocabulary, the temptation of a cheap seduction, the passive yielding to fashion, the consciousness of the avant-garde, in other words, ignorance, are evidences of this effect. The inflation of the sign language is the inflation of the sign itself. Absolute inflation. Inflation itself. Okay. Now, that is probably pretty confusing. And in fact, sorry, I just got a text.